Indycar is known for being one of the most competitive top-level racing categories in the world. However, even though every team is usually in with a shout of victory every race, and that the cars are mostly spec, it must be said that there are still teams that tend to struggle more than others. Dale Coyne Racing is one of those teams. Now, in recent years their performances have improved. The likes of Sebastian Bourdais, Romain Grosjean, etc. had put in eye-catching results in Dale Coyne machinery on a fairly consistent basis. However, there's no getting away from the fact that Dale Coyne Racing is one of, if not the, smallest team on the grid from a budgetary perspective. They have competed in every season of top-level American open-wheel racing since 1984, but rarely through a season would they have the same driver lineup for a whole year, sometimes not competing in races at all. In 2014, the team had one of those seasons where they had two drivers racing the entire season, those being the number 18 of Carlos Huertas and the number 19 of the late Justin Wilson. Justin had competed in every race for Dale Coyne from 2012 to 2014, and in that time had gotten one victory at Texas in 2012, and also finished an impressive 6th place in the driver standings for 2013, with 7 top 5 finishes, 4 of those being podiums. 2014 wasn't quite as good of a year results-wise, sadly, but for sure Justin was still an asset for any team, let alone a small team like Dale Coyne. For 2015 though, Justin wouldn't be back with the Dale Coyne team. Instead, they'd be looking elsewhere for their pilots, to begin their journey into Indycar's Aerokit era, an era that made cars which everyone loved, universally. I must admit that I am one of the people that actually doesn't mind the look of these things, but let's just move on like I never said it before you go and say how wrong I am in the comment section. The season began at the typical starting point of St. Petersburg, where the numbers 18 and 19 would be utilised by the team once again. In car 18, Carlos Huertas was back. Last year the Colombian rookie had a year that yielded nothing much in terms of standout results. Other than an astonishing victory in the first race at Houston. Nevertheless, Carlos in the upcoming year was still hoping to gain experience in the Indycar series. Huertas said, "The formula this year is new for me and the rest, so that's a big challenge, and you have to work a lot closer with the team." Dale Coyne said, "The effort the team has made over the winter, as shown by our Sebring test with Carlos, gives us confidence for the upcoming season." For car 19, it would be Italian driver Francesco Dracone, an IndyCar rookie, despite having competed in a couple of IndyCar races in the past, in 2010 for Conquest Racing. In the following years, Dracone would be racing in AutoGP before getting another shot at the IndyCar series. Francesco said, "It's great being here, picking up the pace again with the IndyCar at this new circuit for me. It's just exciting." Whilst Dale said, "Francesco shows great enthusiasm for our sport. We look forward to working with the rookie in pre-season testing and early races as he looks to IndyCar for his future." So with the seats now assigned, it was off to the first round. However, I feel I'd ought to mention that both these seats were confirmed fairly late on, just a couple of weeks before the first round of the season kicked off. Just to put into context where we're at with the current IndyCar silly season, most of the drivers have been confirmed for the 2024 season, and we're not even in 2024 yet. It is obviously more preferable if you have your drivers sewn up for the following season as soon as you can to give stability. The team had left it pretty late, but still, at least they had some. But how would they get on? Well, qualifying didn't go brilliantly. Both cars would be at the back. Dracone was slower than Huertas, but would start ahead of him on account of how Dracone's group set the faster lap time. Both cars lagged behind at the start, although given the carnage that occurred in front of them, that was possibly the best idea. Unfortunately though, Huertas' race wouldn't last very long whatsoever. On lap 20, he pitted with a steering issue. Specifically, he was struggling to turn right, and so decided to go off to the garage to see what the problem was. As it turned out, upon further inspection, it wasn't a mechanical issue that was causing the steering problems, but a setup change after the morning warm-up session that wasn't to Huertas' liking. Meanwhile for Dracone, an alternative pit strategy meant that he was able to stay with his competition. However, his race too was over on lap 70. This time, it was an engine calibration problem. Basically, the engine was hitting the rev limiter far too many times than it should have done on the streets of St. Petersburg, costing the Italian lap time. The two Dale Coyne cars were the only ones that retired from the race. On to the first race at NOLA for the Indy cars, with Huertas and Dracone back once again. Sadly, both the Coyne cars would qualify on the back row. The upside of that though is that it wasn't on pure pace. Qualifying was abandoned due to rain, so the grid had to be decided by the entrant championship point standings, and with both coin cars not finishing, they were put at the back. For the race, it would also be wet. Not raining, but with a sodden track surface and grass that was even more saturated, it was clear that just keeping your nose clean was going to yield you a good finishing position. The race began and was pretty clean on the most part, with drivers pitting for dry tyres 12 laps into the race. The first caution would come out for Gabby Chavez, and some cars would head down pit road under this yellow, including Carlos Huertas. Meanwhile, Dracone was third in line as they came back to the green. However, he was actually a lap down, and worse was to come, because as he was getting lapped by cars behind, Francesco and Elio Castroneves made contact, with the Italian suffering a spin and puncture in the process. However, even worse was to come after that. Some of you may not want to see the following incident, even though everyone involved escaped without any serious injuries, so if you don't, skip to this time code. Dracone came into the pits and lost the rear end coming into his pit box, in the process hitting a crew member. That crew member being his crew chief, Todd Phillips. Todd would suffer a cut on his nose and a gash on his calf muscle, but was mostly okay beyond that. Dracone would retire from the race. After another caution flew for Sage Karam, several drivers would dive for pit road for a fuel stop, but one of those drivers who didn't was Huertas. That pit stop I referenced earlier had put him second behind James Hinchcliffe, and if the race was full of cautions, Huertas wouldn't need to stop again due to the race being run to a 2-hour time limit. Plus, James was in a more precarious situation fuel-wise than Carlos. Once again, whilst the ultimate speed was lacking, Coyne's team had done a fantastic job on strategy. A win was even possible according to Coyne himself, so long as Huertas didn't do what he ended up doing. Huertas lost the rear end on one of the streams of water coming to the restart and would end up in the inside wall. Carlos's hopes of another miracle win were dashed. He'd get back going, but would finish one lap down in 16th place. Next up, Long Beach, where Dracone was back once again. But Huertas would not be sitting in the number 18 this weekend. No, instead making his IndyCar debut, sports car veteran Rocky Moran Jr. Recently he'd been competing for the Jaguar GT2 effort in the American Le Mans series. However, he would finally accomplish a lifelong ambition. He said, "Dale is a dream maker, and I have always dreamed of this opportunity. We just need to run a lot of miles, as I am aware of the hill I have to climb. But I love Long Beach, and this is truly a dream come true for me." He had tested an IndyCar in 2014, so it wasn't completely alien to these machines, but it was of course going to be challenging all the same. How would he get on though? Well, as it turned out, not only would he not make the race, but he wouldn't even make qualifying. On Friday, during free practice 2, Moran Jr. and Carlos Munoz would have coming together, spinning both drivers around, with Rocky hitting the wall. This collision would end up breaking Rocky's thumb, and he wouldn't be able to race. As it later turned out to be, Moran Jr. didn't drive in any other races that season, and hasn't driven in an IndyCar session since then. So, with Rocky out, there was a vacant slot in the number 18, and it would be taken by someone who has become known as the go-to guy to fill in a driver's spot. It can only be our resident stand-in pilot, Connor Daly, making his debut road course appearance in the IndyCar series. In fact, he was having his breakfast when he got a phone call from Dale and left to get a seat fitting before he was even able to finish his breakfast. Now there's a racing driver with his priorities straight. That being said though, given how this was his first non-oval event, and he'd only had one practice session to get acclimatised to the car, he did a pretty decent job in qualifying. Sure, he was 21st on the grid, but he wasn't that far off his closest competitors. Dracone meanwhile was one spot behind him. In the race, it was a thankfully dull affair, which would doubtlessly be music to Coyne's ears. Dracone would finish 2 laps down in 21st, whilst Daly would have a pretty decent run, finishing 17th comfortably on the lead lap. Whilst not the sort of finishing position that any team would be shouting home about, it was a really competent drive by the Indiana-based driver. Round 4 was at Barber. Dracone was back, but the A-team would have its 4th different pilot in 3 separate rounds. This time it would be Venezuelan driver Rodolfo Gonzalez. He too had tested an IndyCar recently, but his racing resume was very extensive in Europe with a number of GP2 seasons under his belt, whilst also being a Formula 1 test and reserve driver for Marussia in 2013. Once again though, this was his IndyCar debut. How would he get on? Qualifying wise, again, both the coin cars were at the back. Gonzalez 21st and Ciccone 23rd. In the race, Ciccone again struggled, finishing last as one of the two cars that were a lap down, while Gonzalez would end up 20th. But that doesn't tell you the whole story. Gonzalez was part of a group of cars that didn't pit just after the halfway point of the race, meaning he was as high as 10th place, but would gradually fall down the order with the cars on fresher tyres behind. Not that this seemed to faze Gonzalez in any measurable way whatsoever, because he was defending positions with absolutely no mercy. He was fair, but was not prepared to give up his positions easily. James Hinchcliffe, Sebastian Bourdais and Simon Pagenaud very much found this out. He would pit later on, but still could have finished above the 20th place that he ended up being, if it wasn't for having to pit for fuel with a couple of laps left. Signs of promise, but at this point the team still hadn't had a better result than 16th place. On to the Indy GP, where Huertas returned to the 18, and Ciccone was back in the 19. For qualifying, Huertas was 23rd, Ciccone in 25th. Although apparently Huertas' effort was impacted by his engine letting go just before completing his lap. The race was another quiet affair for the coin cars, both cars finishing at least one lap down. Huertas was 19th, Ciccone 22nd. However, as it would later turn out to be, this is, at the time of this recording, Ciccone's last race in IndyCar. Either way, it was on to the big one, the 99th running of the Indy 500. Usually, coin would enter 3 cars for this race, and this year was no exception. Yet, nobody seemed to know who would be piloting the 19 car. Huertas was in the 18, whilst the number 63 of Pippa Mann was ready for her annual attempt at the greatest spectacle in racing. Pippa said, "The last time I strapped into a race car may have been last May, but I feel very fortunate to have had such strong support from the Delco Racing team and from team owner Del Coyne over the past 12 months. We are all thrilled to bring this pink programme back for a second year running." Back to the 19 car meanwhile, and a driver had been assigned, Australian James Davison. Except, there was a bit of a hurdle to overcome. You see, James's main racing commitment that year was the Pirelli World Challenge, and on the qualifying weekend, they had an event going on at Mossport in Canada, which would put James out of action for the qualifying days, so someone else would have to qualify for him. That driver would end up being Frenchman Tristan Vautier, who last competed in IndyCar in 2013. Now this wasn't unheard of, but was certainly a rare thing to have happen. And just think about Tristan for a second. You're out there doing 220 miles an hour for 4 laps straight, doing some of the most intense and nerve-jangling, underwear-destroying laps of your life. Yet, you wouldn't be the one who gets to compete in the fabled race. Instead, doing it for someone else. Was it a noble and brave thing to do? Of course. But I can't imagine how that must have felt. All 3 Dale Coyne cars would qualify for the race. Huertas was 18th, Vautier qualifying for Davison was 21st, whilst Pippa Mann was 28th, although she did have this crash in free practice. However, the story doesn't end there. On the Thursday before the race, an inner ear infection meant that Carlos wasn't cleared to race, meaning a spot on the grid was available. Vautier was meant to race in England, so he was ruled out. So who could have filled the void? Drivers rumoured to get the 19 car before Davison included Catherine Legg and Vitor Mirra. In the end though, the ride would go to Tristan Vautier, the saviour of all of the Del Coyne team's problems. Yes, Tristan would end up having quite possibly the strangest Indy 500 month there has ever been. From qualifying one car to which he was never meant to race, to being given a different ride for the same team in a race that he was never meant to take part in anyway, and to make this even more bonkers, he got a car that was actually faster than the one he qualified. Overall, some big brain strats by the 2012 Indy Lights champion. But I will though say that Tristan wouldn't actually be starting in 18th place due to the driver change, so would start 32nd. Although there was one consolation. He would be starting ahead of the car that he qualified, as James Davison replaced Vautier. I mean, what an insane turn of events this was. With all that being said though, how would the 3 get on in the race? Well, they would make progress, but it would all come to nothing. in what turned out to be yet another set of almost unthinkable circumstances. Although again, pit crew members were hit in this instance, so if you don't want to see this one, go to the timecode on the screen. After a caution involving a crash between Ed Carpenter and Oriol Servia, drivers would be flooding down pit road. Pippa Mann got out of her pit stall first, but as she was travelling in the slower lane, James Davison came out of his box, collided with her, sending Davison into Vautier's car and a couple of his crew members. All three coin cars were involved in a pit road collision. Unfortunately, one of the two pit crew members would suffer a broken ankle, whilst the other would only have a few aches and pains. The incident would put Vautier and Davison out of the race, in one of the most bemusing months of May that two drivers have had. Pippa Mann would carry on avoiding incidents along the way, but would sadly end up finishing 3 laps down in 22nd place. With that, it was on to the duel in Detroit. Car 18 had Rodolfo Gonzalez back in the car, whilst 19 would have Tristan Vautier return for his first road course of the season. In practice and qualifying, both drivers were looking to reacclimatise themselves with street circuit driving, hence how they clipped the wall on the odd occasion. Yet despite this, Vautier would qualify an impressive 11th for race 1, the team's best starting position so far. Rodolfo, meanwhile, was 23rd. That, though, was in the dry. But what if we added water? Sure, let's add to the challenge. Vautier stayed in and around the mid-pack at the start, but Gonzalez was keen to make up places from the back, until the second green flag lap, where he spun at turn 2. I mean, you'll have to trust me on that because, as you can tell, visibility was suboptimal. The track dried up though incredibly quickly, and Vautier was still around the mid-pack. That was until Carlos Munoz went for a gap, and Vautier went wide, trying to give the Colombian a car's width on the inside, and gently brushed the tyres. He got back going, but wrecked his chances of a good finishing position. A few laps after that, Gonzalez hit the same wall Vautier did in qualifying, but hit it too hard, damaging one of the wheel hubs, and putting him out of the event. The race would be called early due to heavy rain and lightning, with Vautier coming home 1 lap down in 17th. Qualifying for race 2 was impacted by rain again. Gonzalez in Group 1 was able to set a time, which would put him 22nd, whilst Vautier would end up last, because anyone who was in Group 2 would be ordered on entrant points, because of heavy rain making the circuit undrivable. And once again the weather would play a part in this race as well. For the second duel, the Delcoin team would once again attempt a miracle fuel strategy. However, this wouldn't work for Gonzalez though. He would hit the wall at turn 4, bringing out the yellow, and bringing his race to an early end. This strategy would work though for Vautier, because as the cautions went by, others ahead pitted, and through some great aggressive driving, Vautier would finally give his team a positive finishing position. He said after the race, "It was a fine line between aggressive and keeping the car in one piece, but we found it today, so it is amazing. It wasn't a top 15 or even a top 10, a top 5 finish, 4th place for the Frenchman, passing Juan Pablo Montoya on the last lap. Like I said earlier, the saviour for all of Delcoin Racing's problems, Tristan Vautier." Okay, let's just move on to Texas Motor Speedway. Car 18 would have a different driver in it once again, but it was still a return to Delcoin Racing for Pippa Mann, whilst the almighty Tristan Vautier would be back in the 19 car. In qualifying, Vautier would come out on top with 16th place, while Mann was 22nd, albeit she was focusing more on race runs. The pair would make progress up the field as the race began, but would steadily drop further back as the race went on, although Vautier wouldn't even get to the finish, with a problem on the right rear suspension. Mann would though get to the finish, 6 laps down, in 17th place. Over to the only non-American round of the season at Toronto, where we welcome back Rodolfo Gonzalez to the 18 car. Gonzalez was 23rd, Vautier in 21st after qualifying. However, Vautier's race was hampered somewhat by coming together at turn 3 on lap 1 with Stefano Coletti. Tristan wouldn't have a great day having to manage fuel whilst recording a finish of 17th. For Rodolfo, it was 18th place, but that doesn't explain the whole story again, because he was on an alternative strategy, although given how often the Delcoin team utilised these fantastic so-called alternative strategies, I wouldn't be too surprised if they were actually plan A in the engineering room. Anyhow, unlike most of the field, Gonzalez would stay out under the first caution, thus climbing to 4th place, and he was once again demonstrating that he was not intimidated by the teams and drivers around him, with some robust yet acceptable defending. The strategy though would end up not working, because another caution period came out at just the wrong time. Gonzalez would end up leading 5 laps in the latter stages of the race, but would be forced to pit for fuel. Rodolfo said after the race, "It was certainly fun. It is only my 3rd race, and to be spending any time leading is great." Fontana next, an event that turned out to be one of the most enthralling races I'd ever seen. For the Dale Coyne team, however, it was a fairly mixed bag. After Vautier and the returning Pippa Mann qualified 20th and 22nd respectively, the race would yield a fairly happy side of the garage, and one that would not be as happy. Mann ended up 13th, her best ever Indycar finish to date. For Vautier though, it was a case of what it could have been. After climbing up the field in the early portion of the race, his race was utterly ruined during an early pit stop, where once again another pit road incident involving crew members occurred. And again, here's the time code if you want to skip the incident. Vautier made an error which made him hit one of his front tyre changes. Astonishingly, whilst the crew member was on a back brace, scans concluded that he had no injuries. This incident would put Tristan well out of contention, and would come home 17th, 4 laps down. Tristan and Pippa returned for the short oval at Milwaukee. The pair qualified towards the back, with Vautier 20th and Mann 23rd. Unfortunately, this race too yielded little success. Vautier ran longer in the first stint of the race, and pitted just before all the fuel burned away. However, the cars that stopped for fresher tyres before him set quick enough lap times to put him 1 lap down. He was never able to recover from there, thus finishing 16th. Mann meanwhile had an utterly atrocious race. She had handling issues in qualifying, and in the race, those same issues stayed. What those handling issues were, I'm not sure, but whatever they were enough to put her out of the race on lap 27. From one short oval to another at Iowa, qualifying was a struggle once again. Vautier 20th and Mann in 22nd. Mann would once again suffer handling issues, particularly when it came to the night time, where it understeered a huge amount, and also the steering became rather heavy. Due to fears of having an accident, Pippa took the decision to retire from the race. 2 race weekends in a row featuring tricky race cars for the Englishwoman. Vautier's race was a bit better. He was able to get into good fights with the likes of Will Power, for example. However, when Power got ahead, the dirty air impacted Tristan's car and would cause him to go a lap down. He would still finish in 12th though, the second best finishing position of the season for a Dale Coyne entry. Back to a road course now at Mid-Ohio, and Rodolfo was also back for his road course program this season. Qualifying was, well, a disappointingly similar affair. Gonzalez 22nd, Vautier in 24th, although the almighty Vautier did try and think of intriguing weight-saving solutions during practice. As they were at the back though, and with a caution coming out early, it was another opportunity to implement Dale Coyne's stupendously splendid strategy solutions. The Coyne cars would pit under this caution, whilst the leading cars would stop later, which enabled Vautier to inherit the lead of the race before he would pit for fuel, although this slow stop would cost him time. Vautier would hold off drivers on this alternative strategy, but with his last scheduled pit stop, he'd have to hope for a caution to make it more certain that he'd get to the end. Cue Sage Karam having a spin and bringing out the caution. This would elevate him to 5th, but would lose a position on the restart. For Gonzalez, whilst he was on the same strategy, his race wouldn't pan out as well, on account of the fact that he lost one of his rear wheel covers, hampering his handling and losing performance. He would end up in 20th place, after also getting into some intense racing with Stefano Coletti. Vautier though would maintain his 6th place, earning the team just its 2nd top 10 result of the season. After the race he said, "I had a blast out there. I was able to put in some very good lap times while saving some fuel. It was great to be able to lead some laps with such a good race car." After this was the event at Pocono. Although due to the awful accident involving Justin Wilson, I'm only going to briefly cover the race for the Dale Coyne cars. Vautier qualified 13th, Mann qualified 17th. Vautier got involved in an accident on lap 92 and would finish 21st, whilst Mann had an electrical issue which would put her several laps down, but carried on to finish in 13th in her final start of the season. Finally, it was on to Sonoma, where Rodolfo was back in the 18. In qualifying, Gonzalez was 24th, Vautier was 23rd, although Gonzalez had a time that was good enough to make the second round of qualifying had he have not ran wide at the final corner due to oil. Once again, an alternative strategy would be utilised, which would certainly benefit Gonzalez, who, whilst making a name for himself in the racecraft department, battling against his competition, his out-and-out speed wasn't very consistent. until this round, where he showed genuinely impressive pace. Gonzalez drove a really decent race, collecting 9th place, the team's 3rd top 10 of the year, and certainly his best finishing position. Vautier didn't quite seem to have as much pace, although his race would be hindered by contact that got one of his wheels slightly askew. He would have to make a number of pit stops just to make sure that the risk of a car-destroying crash wouldn't happen. Thus, he would finish in a lowly 23rd place, 3 laps down. And that would conclude the season. A season that, whilst had its bright moments, was mostly full of driver swaps, strange occurrences and coincidences, inconsistencies, and just a general lack of out-and-out speed. Despite this though, the 2 Dale Coyne cars would not be the last full season entries in the entrance standings. Both entries would finish ahead of the number 4 KV Racing Technology entry, driven by Stefano Coletti, with the 19 finishing above the 18. Although whilst Coletti's season wasn't great, he still showed glimpses of potential on a more consistent basis than the Coyne entries did. In fact, really and truly, had it not have been for some standout drives by the almighty Vautier, Gonzalez's run at Sonoma, and Coyne assisting them with their usual top-tier alternative strategy options, both cars would in all likelihood have finished below Coletti's entry. But hey, that's not what the statistics will say. For 2016, there was much more stability on the driving front. Connor Daly did the full year in the 18 car, although car 19 still had 4 different drivers competing in it that year. But for 2017, the team would have had in all likelihood 2 full season entries with full season drivers, had it not have been for Bourdais' injuries after his Indy 500 qualifying crash. So the team has gotten better since its 2015 rollercoaster, but as seasons go, 2015 was not one that any Dale Coyne racing fan will look back on with too many fond memories. However, that is going to be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and well done for getting to the end as well. If you did enjoy this video, then I would be enormously appreciative if you did hit the like and subscribe buttons. Plus, what other IndyCar teams had some seasons that you feel they'd rather all to forget? Say in the comment section down below. But until the next video, be kind to each other and enjoy the rest of your day.